After shooting photos and videos for over 13 years, I get asked this number one question, the number one question of all. What camera should I buy? Now, this could be an upgrade or this could be just your first camera, but this is a very important question to answer, and it's not an easy question to answer, but it actually is a lot more simple than you think. Once you get through this 11 question quiz, I'm going to direct you into exactly what camera you should buy. After this quiz, you should know exactly what camera to upgrade to or what camera that you should buy for your first camera. Understand that I started out with, the likes of an XTI, a Nikon Coolpix, this point and shoot camera. Then I moved up to a T1i on the Canon end, and that T1i stayed with me to this day. I still have access to the T1i. I gave it to my brother, but that's on another story. I still have access to that camera because that camera can still do some kind of good. So at the end of the day, the best camera you have is the one you have with you. And please make your own decision wisely, but I'm sure these 11 questions will point you into the right direction. Now, before we start the questions, you have to understand that you make your own decisions. I don't make your decisions for you, of course. These are questions to help guide you. So choose at your own discretion of what camera that you want to buy after these questions. But you also have to understand that we're talking about mirrorless cameras and DSLRs. Those are the only ones that I'm going to be directly recommending throughout this video because they're the ones that are the most confusing. Question number 1. What will you shoot visually with this camera? Now, I'm talking about how much of what will you shoot. It's going to be either photos or videos, right? So how much of that are you going to be shooting with this camera? 50-50, 70-30, 30-70, or 100% in one or 100% in the other. Now, as far as 50-50 and 70-30, I would say for 50-50, Canon takes the cake on this one because Canon has amassed a brand that has a whole bunch of cameras, probably more cameras in any lineup, that allows you to do the most for the cheapest cost, and it gives you a lot of specs and features that people are going to need for both. I'm not saying they're mastering in one. I'm just saying with flip out screens, they probably have the more flip out screens than any other brand, and the flip out screens flip out towards the actual person that's vlogging. And Panasonic has flip out screens that flip the same way that Canons do, but they're different. And then you have Sony would come in second place in this factor. Sony is a close second because Sony has a decent amount of newer cameras that give you the image quality that you want, that give you the lens selection that you want, things of that nature. 70-30 and 30-70, I would still go with either Canon or Sony on that one. As far as the 100%ers, for 100% video, I would either choose Sony or Canon. But as far as the 100% photo, I would actually go with Nikon because Nikon has great photographing cameras. Now, people say, oh, the color science is a little greenish or whatever, but the skin tone is a little bit off. Yeah, people give it that. But at the end of the day, Nikon is a solid photographic camera. It competes pretty much neck and neck with Canon as far as photography is concerned. It's way better at dynamic range and low light at higher ISOs. So, for example, if you're taking pictures in a gym and you don't have any light to use other than the lights that they give you, and you're taking pictures of your son, your daughter, or whatever, and things of that nature, you're going to want a Nikon because Nikon gives you way more dynamic range and they give you better sensors for the actual amount of money that you're spending. Question number 2, what do you like/need most in a camera? Now, this is specifically talking about specs here. And we got, 4 questions or 4 answers here that you can go with. And you got A, colors. Colors, a lot of people really side with Canon on the colors. I know at this point people are like, oh, you're a Canon fanboy. Yeah, I use Canons mainly, but I do shoot with the other cameras as well. Panasonic is also pretty decent with colors. Sony is okay with colors. From my experience, they might come out a little greenish along with Nikons because Sony used to make Nikon sensors on the smaller end, and they still have a little bit of a stake in some of the smaller end Nikon sensors. So Nikon and Sony tend to look better on or the same on the colors. Megapixels wise, Canon has a 5 DSR, but at the same time, Nikon has a lot of high megapixel bodies. So if your megapixels is the number one thing you need, you might want to go with Nikon. And then Sony. So Nikon number 1, Sony number 2, and Canon number 3. Canon doesn't have a lot of high megapixel bodies. So if you're trying to crop, if you're trying to have a high resolution print, go with Nikon on that one. Dynamic range, go with Nikon on that one. Let's see, strong colors, I would also go with Nikon. These are all really, in this question, photographic type of questions. You know, megapixels is not really something that we look forward to in video. As a matter of fact, with the A7S, a lot of people say that lower the megapixels, the better dynamic range you have and the less noise you have, that kind of thing. So I would say Nikon really wins question number 2. Question number 3, how do you like your camera controls? With lots of control, with minimal control, you figure it out for yourself, what you like out of the bunch. But at the end of the day, I would say Canon has the better controls out of all the brands. And they have simpler menus. They kind of all around easy to use, easy to navigate through the menus. It doesn't look complicated and anybody can do it. And it has a lot of help screens. Same thing with, well, Nikon has help screens, but the menus and the buttons seem a little cluttered in my opinion. You get buttons all the way out to the lenses. Now, pros might like buttons all the way out to the lenses, but people who are just starting out may not like buttons all the way out to the lenses. I personally like the Canon feel. I like the buttons being on the back and how most of the buttons in most of the price ranges tend to mimic each other, especially this new Eos-r 5 and the T8i. They tend to piggyback off of all the cameras that came before them, and you get a similar control. Now, with the minimal controls, Canon has probably the most minimal controls. When it comes to more technical controls, you got Nikon. So get Nikon if you want to be technical, if you want to have that pro feel and things of that nature. Let's see, Sony, they have the most cluttered menus. Everybody thinks Sony has the worst menus, and it's kind of a fact at this point. It's not even just by opinion. Sony just has the worst menu system in the game, but those cameras are great. So if you can, get through the menu system, if you want a camera for a certain price and Sony has everything you need, you might want to get Sony just because. But if you want simple everything, I would go with Canon. Question number 4. What are your priorities for this camera? Now, this is just like a two answer question, but this one specifically gets at to what are you willing to do? Are you willing to spend more money to get a certain type of camera, or are you willing to spend less money to get a great camera? So you have to understand exactly, if you spend more money, you get a great camera. You get like an awesome camera. Like if you're spending at 1DX Mark III money, you're going to get a 1DX Mark III. It's going to be a big, chunky, substantial camera that shoots all the frames you're ever going to need. It's never going to bog down. It's going to pretty much go up mountains with you, and you can have it for the rest of your life. Yes, that's an amazing camera. If you're on the cheaper side, like most people are, they don't want to spend, thousands and thousands of dollars for their first camera. They just want to get into it. You can probably buy something used that's still great, like a 5D Mark II. Now, it won't have the best autofocus system in the world, but it definitely will give you great image quality. And that's for the Canon side. But there's an equivalent for the Nikon side, and there's an equivalent for the Sony side. An older camera, I know exactly for the Sony, you got your A7R, that's still a camera. Now, Sony has had issues in the past with overheating and all this other stuff with the new implementation of full-frame mirrorless cameras, but yeah, you do have a good chance of buying a good used camera in all brands. Like, for example, Nikon has a really good Nikon D610, and it's a good full-frame camera for a decent, cheap price, and it's really good for the amount of money that you're going to be spending for it. So those are the top 3 brands, and that's what you need to weigh here. You need to weigh whether or not you want a cheap camera and get some great stuff out of it, or get the best camera with everything out of it. And chances are, if you're going to spend the most for the camera, you're probably, don't necessarily need to be looking at the rest of this. But chances are there's still some stuff in here that you might need. All right, the next question talks about longevity. And next question number 5 is, how long do you intend on having this camera? Now, 1 year, you got your 5 year, your 10 year, as long as you can, and maybe you'll upgrade it and sell the other one for an upgrade. Now, the reason I distinguished all of these is because most of the brands are going to give you a camera that will last you for years and years and years. The only camera that hasn't been vetted for years and years and years is the Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras. Now, Sony, especially the newer ones, the Sony mirrorless full-frame alpha SLRs, they tend to have this newer technology. The newer technology, and I'm not saying these cameras are not durable, but they haven't been vetted for over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. For example, my Canon 5D Mark II, it's been out since 2008 or 2008, I believe. And you have to understand that it's been vetted for over years and I'm still using it. It's 11, 12 years old now, and I am still using the mess out of this camera. No Sony Alpha camera has been out for that long, so there's no way you're going to know if they have that kind of longevity. And also you have to understand that cameras have shutter actuations. Now, the Sony cameras have the electronic shutter and the manual mechanical shutter, but you got to understand that that has not been vetted working together over years and decades and decades and decades, like these Canon and Nikon DSLRs. So if I were you, I would stay with Nikon and Canon if you're going to hold a DSLR for years and years and years. This fully digital implemented sensor-based IBIS and all this other stuff, or in-body image stabilization that Sony calls it, it hasn't been vetted for over years. So I would stick with Nikon and Canon if you're going over 10 years for a camera. Question number 6. What type of photos and videos are you going to be shooting with this camera? And I'm talking about landscapes, portraits in action, sports. You got your events, or you got your generalists. Are you going to be a generalist in videos or photos? And what I mean by generalist is you're going to do a little bit of everything. Now, let's say if you're doing landscape and only landscapes, you probably want to stick with a high megapixel camera like a Canon 5DSR, or you want to stick with your Nikon D850. You want to, D810 if you don't have the budget for a D850. D850 is known as one of the best cameras in the world, especially for photography. But you got to understand, you want one of those high megapixel bodies. You're not talking about a flagship at this point. You're talking about the level under the flagship. The way the camera that works under the flagship, like your on the Sony side, you got your A7R series, your A7R Mark 1, 2, and 3, and Mark 4 that just came out not too long ago. You have these cameras that have high megapixels. The Sony A7R Mark IV has 60 megapixels. You can make big prints, big detailed prints. You can stack a whole bunch of images, do your dynamic range. You can put filters on there and still get great image quality out of your cameras, despite whatever lens you might put on the front of that thing. At 16 megapixels, you can pretty much get whatever you want out of, a good lens. I'm not going to say just any lens. I'm going to retract that last statement. You got to have a decent lens. But Sony makes great lenses, and also third parties make great lenses for Sony. For example, Sigma Art lenses. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a camera with high megapixels. The two camera brands that have the most megapixels, like I said before, are Nikon and Sony. Not only are Nikon and Sony the higher megapixel brands, but they have cheaper cameras because since they've had these higher megapixels for over a longer period of time than Canon, they tend to offer you cheaper, higher megapixel bodies because they just moved up the megapixels faster than Canon. That doesn't make Canon a bad brand or the worst brand or losing to one brand over the other. That just means they offer you way more higher megapixel bodies for a cheaper cost because they've had them around for a longer time. And you can also probably buy some used versions of these older cameras and still get a lot out of your camera. Remember that it's not all about the camera. It's a lot it has a lot to do with the lens, especially in these high megapixel type of settings like landscapes and stuff like that. Now, as far as sports and action, I would go with either Nikon or Canon. And you could throw Sony in there if you got a lot of money. If you got money for a Sony A9 Mark II or Mark I, then I would go Sony for the sports. Anything other than that, I would go Nikon or Canon if you're trying to save money, because Nikon and Canon have definitely been doing sports way longer than Sony has, especially with full frame sensors and bigger bodies. And why is this important? Because usually when you do sports, you need telephoto lenses with wide apertures, fast lenses. And even though Sony has a good base for lenses for their mirrorless bodies at this point, they definitely still need to catch up to Canon and Nikon on the used market, because Canon and Nikon definitely have a big selection of long lenses, your 100 millimeter primes, your 200, your 70 to 200s, your holy grails, your 300 millimeters, and your 400 millimeters. So if you're doing action, wildlife, sports, anything like that, you're going to need a camera brand that has the base for you in lenses. It's all about the lenses, because not only do you need 100 millimeters, 200, 300, 400 millimeter glass, but you also need fast glass, and that requires a lens with a 2.8 aperture or faster. You might be saying, well, why do they call it fast glass if it's just the aperture? Well, the aperture allows you to let in more light. The more light you let in, the faster your shutter speed can be. So that's why they call it fast glass, because you can make your camera operate faster on the exposure. All right, so the next thing we want to get into is the portraits. Portraits, you also want some fast glass. And fast glass, not for the reason that your subject's going to be moving, but fast glass also gives you another added benefit, which is a shallow depth of field, that blurry background. Everybody wants that fast glass to give you that blurry background, that quality blur, or bokeh as we like to call it, and that's Japanese for blur as well. But yeah, you want fast glass, you want some prime glass as well. So your 50 millimeter primes, your 85 millimeter prime. My favorite lens is a 90 millimeter prime from Tamron 2.8, but you want your 2.8s, your 1.8s, your 1.4s. Your 1.4s, your 1.8s, and 2.8s will also work for sports photography, but you're more than likely to find some prime lenses that are cheap at 1.4, 1.2, 1.8, 2.0, 2.8. Those are the f-stops that you're looking for to blur out that background and put your subject into focus and bring that presence to your subject, that sought-after look that I'm pretty sure you've seen somewhere at some point in time. Actually, going back to portraits real quick. Portraits, Canon, Nikon, and Sony has some good options as well. So all three of them kind of tie at this, because Sony has good options for their mirrorless bodies, and those mirrorless bodies can really focus on the eyes. So I would definitely think about Sony when I'm thinking about portraits. Also, Canon in second place and Nikon in third place, because Nikon doesn't have as many lenses amassed as Canon has. But at the same time, I would say Sony and Canon are in the tie, but don't forget about Nikon. Now going back to the events portion, I would say any of the three brands would be good for events. Now, any of these three brands are good for events because all of them have decent lenses. They all have a holy grail focal distance worth of lenses. 14 to 24, your 24 to 70, your 70 to 200. That's your holy grail of focal distances. So as long as you have those lenses, you should be able to do pretty much anything. And most brands have that available for you because they know that that's a standard, and they know that that's easy for photographers to frame up their shot. Now, if you're a generalist, E and F, questions E and F, or answers E and F, you're probably going to shoot with any of these three brands. You probably want to get a brand that will go with you for a long time, because if you're a generalist, you're probably going to be wanting to shoot full frame cameras. Canon has a large body of full frame cameras. Nikon have a large body of full frame cameras, along with Sony, who, even though they don't have as many full frame bodies, they have cheaper full frame bodies. What you also need to understand is, even though they have cheaper full frame bodies, their lenses tend to cost you an arm and a leg, especially if you're buying the native lenses. You can adapt lenses to the Sony body to save money if you have Canon lenses or Nikon lenses laying around. But you know, and I don't even know if that many adapters are out there for Nikon, but Sony definitely does have a a curve to get over when it comes to lenses. You probably end up buying a cheap lens on a full frame camera, and that's not what you want to do. You really want to get a good lens for a full frame camera, because a good lens for a full frame camera really respects the amount of image quality coming out of that full frame sensor. You have to also understand that since Nikon and Canon have been around longer, you have more options at your disposal, especially at cheaper prices. So if you wanted to buy a 5D Mark II and get a 70-200, that would probably get you great image quality and be cheaper than anything that you would buy on the Sony side. The same thing goes for Nikon. If you were to buy anything on the Nikon side, say, like I said before in that last question, a D610 with a really, really good holy grail lens like a 24-70 or a 14-24, you'd be better off and cheaper saving money. And you can save that money for something else that you might need, like a speed light or stands, tripods, monopods, all these things. All right, question number 7, and this is a simple one. What's the size of your camera you prefer? Now, it's really hard to get a small camera and have it attached to a big lens. It's kind of an irony, because you have to understand that the manufacturers are trying to make the cameras as small as they possibly can, but physics says, hey, we need these lenses to be a certain size. Because you just won't be able to get light to that camera. Now, technology has come very far, and the sensor technology it's able to really distinguish, especially on cell phones, what's going on in the real world and how to auto expose and present a great picture for the amount of light that you're giving it. But you still have to amass a lot of light to get a good image. In any case, have you ever taken a cell phone into a dark situation and got nothing but grain? That's the concept that we're talking about here. The amount of light you're able to let into your camera. So if you have a big camera, you're probably going to have all the advantages that you want. But the smaller camera you tend to get, the less you allow for that camera. Because if you got to travel, you might need a pancake lens, and that pancake lens might not be able to zoom as much, or it might not let in as much light, things of that nature. So you're probably going to have to make a concession somewhere in this I want a big camera or I want a small camera dichotomy. You probably just want to get what's best for you and understand that it's probably going to be remotely big. If you want a small camera, get a mirrorless Sony, but at the same time, if you get big lenses for that small Sony, it's going to end up being just as big as any DSLR with a small lens. So you have to take it with a grain of salt here. But if you want a big camera, go Canon and Nikon. I'm pretty sure everybody knows that by now. All right, so in this next question, this is a pointed question about how much time you're investing in your camera. You might be saying, well, why are you asking us this question? Because this is a really personal question. And this is not to downplay anybody or say this brand requires less practice. And this is all about the learning curve, about learning about what camera you're going to be willing to practice on, or willing to use every day, or willing to use every other day, or whenever you pick it up. Now, question number 8 is, how much are you willing to practice this camera? Now, when you get into the newer cameras, they tend to strip the modes away. For example, your new Eos-r doesn't have as many modes, and your more professional cameras don't have as many modes available to you. So you're probably going to want to go with a cheaper camera that has more modes available to you, much like your fully automatic, your program, or your creative auto mode. All these cameras that are under $1,000 or $1,500 will get you a camera that will allow you to not have to practice it so much to get yourself going. A lot of people have this big stigma about buying their first camera because they're going to be afraid they're going to either mess something up or not be able to use it to its fullest extent. And that's one of the biggest unsaid issues with buying your first camera. I don't necessarily think it's about the camera being good or the camera having exactly what you need. I think it's more so about people not knowing how to use it and not having the willingness to learn exactly how to fulfill that camera's needs to get the best out of that camera. For example, a lot of people don't want to learn anything about the exposure triangle, or they don't want to know about the histograms or your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. They just want to put it on an automatic mode and go. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you're getting what you want out of that camera, I personally would not advise that. I always have an issue with that personally. That's my opinion. But in the grand scheme of things, if I'm being unbiased, there's nothing wrong with you just buying a camera just to buy it, put it in auto mode for the rest of your life and getting what you get out of it, and not using RAW, but using JPEG and things of that nature. So if you want a camera like that, you're probably going to be spending under $1,500 for this camera. The camera is probably going to be $800, $700, $750, $850, and if it's a used version of that camera, probably $400, $300 for such a camera. So you really want to look in that price range for that camera, but all three of these brands can pretty much suffice. Now, Sony, the new kid on the block with their mirrorless full-frame camera, so it's harder to find something cheaper on the Sony side. So I would say, again, Canon or Nikon. Canon sells the most of these cameras, by the way. Question number 9. What's your experience shooting with the camera and shooting your genre style? Now, these answers are pretty much straightforward. Intermediate, you got your pro, you got your I shoot every day, you got your newbie, or I've never shot a camera. Now, number one thing you need to understand, if you have never shot a camera before and you're trying to get your first real camera, quote unquote, you probably just want to go with what they offer at the store. Because, for example, there was one person who contacted me a couple of weeks ago and said, "Hey, Devin, I'm about to get my first camera. What do you recommend?" So on and so forth. And I'm going through this whole list of things about what do you shoot. I'm going through all these questions essentially, and then they say, "Oh no, I'm in the store right now." And so with that being said, a lot of people are not going to put forth the effort to do so much research that they're going to be limited in what they buy. They're typically going to go to either the store or buy it from Amazon. Even though Amazon is great, Amazon does have kind of biased recommendations. For example, they'll recommend you a camera with all this gear that you don't really need that's going to break in like a week. So I would say, to get an unbiased thought after my 13 years of doing everything, probably go with whatever camera that you think is good for you at the time. As a matter of fact, your opinion on pretty much everything photo and video is probably spot on, because a lot of these cameras, especially sub $1,500, they're almost exactly the same at this point. For example, you got your 70D and your Canon 70 Mark II. They're almost essentially the same camera. And these are quite older cameras talking about it now, but if you were to equate it to a camera today, your T7i and your T6S, T6i, essentially the exact same camera, the same camera that you're going to see on the shelf in your own Costco, Best Buy, or anything like that. So I would heavily advise you guys to make sure you just get a camera in your hands, because most of these cameras at the smaller end are almost exactly the same. Now, if you see something different about them, like, for example, the screen flips a different way, that's a big determining factor. But as far as the specs are concerned, you're not really getting much difference for any brand, for that matter, Nikon, Sony, or Canon. Now, Sony does have the little advantage that, you got your mirrorless factor going on, but Sony has had a lot of issues with their smaller bodies, especially the ones that are the earlier models, like your A6000s. They've had issues with overheating and all these other things, because Sony kind of rushed into the market with their new mirrorless full frames. But that's another story. Just know that Sony is a little spotty in that area. Canon is probably the best because they sell the most smaller bodies, because that's how Canon makes the most of their money. Everything else, newbies, you kind of in the same boat. If you want to upgrade, you're probably going to a T5i to a 80D or something like that. In Canon terms, or in Nikon terms, you're probably going from like your D3500 to your D500. You probably have a reason to upgrade, but at the same time, you just want to read the specs. I can't really tell you exactly at the intermediate stage what to do, but if you're at advanced or pro, you probably don't even need these tips at all, but you probably already know what you're going to get. And if you shoot every day, you know exactly what camera you need and what you're missing, probably. But for example, the people who are just buying their first camera or upgrading, you're probably If you're upgrading, you want to take it with a fine-tooth comb and go through every individual spec, especially if you're already investing into a brand. You're probably going to stay with that brand. But if you're a newbie, just get a camera in your hands, because most of these cameras under $1,500, if that's where you're going, is pretty much the same. Now, if you have money, which is rare, if you have money to buy a 1DX Mark III for your first camera, which is rare, you probably really want to go whatever you can get. If you can hack the lens, it's really about the lens. If you can hack the price for the lenses for that brand, then whatever camera you get is pretty much going to give you what you want. You just have to look at the specs. I can't tell you and go through all of that right now, but that's some advice on that question. Number 9 leads us into question number 10. How much are you willing to spend on this camera? 100 to 300? If you're in the 100 to 300 ballpark, you're probably going to be buying used, super used. I'm talking like hand-me-down, because there's not many cameras that you can buy from the $100 to $300 range that is not a hand-me-down or isn't heavily used. But there are some decent ones if you can find them. I'm telling you, there are some decent ones out there if you can find them, but it's not that many. So you're talking about your T1i, for Canon, or you're talking about some old D series from Nikon. I don't even know, because I don't go that far back. Maybe a D2X, but that's a really, really old camera. I wouldn't advise that for anybody now, but it's still a decent camera, and it still will give you decent results. If you figure out how to use it, you can do some great stuff with it. But you can find some good cameras under, but they're going to be super used. They're not going to be anything new, and they're not going to be anything that you're probably going to have to make concessions. For example, the focus is probably not going to be that great. But you might not have like over 13 to 20 megapixels, but it's going to get you somewhere. Next one is 300 to 500. This is a sweet spot for used cameras. You can find a great bit of deal for used cameras at this price point, especially in the Canon range. Canon made a whole bunch of cameras that they just farted out with 18 megapixel sensors that you can find on the market, like your 60D, your T1, your T2i, your T3i, your T4i, your T5i. All these cameras, Canon just farted out with 18 megapixel sensors that you can just find on the market that are essentially the same camera. So you're not really missing out on much. And I started out with a daggone 12 megapixel camera almost 13, 14 years ago. So you should be fine with 18 megapixels, because Canon hasn't really even got past 30 that much, except with their 5D-SR and their 5D Mark IV. So with that being said, megapixels is not the end of the world if that's what you're using for your price barometer. $500 to $1,000, another sweet spot for used cameras. You can buy a good 6D Mark I with what I think is one of Canon's best image sensors ever made. It's gorgeous. What the images that 6D Mark I produces is great. You can get a 5D Mark II. You might be able to squeeze a 5D Mark III depending on where you buy it from. Maybe, but that's a strong maybe. And this is mostly Canon, because I don't know a lot about the other brands and what their used market is like, but also look at your Nikons and your equivalent Sonys for this cost. But let's go to about $1,000 to $3,000. $1,000 to $3,000 is a great price for an actual new camera that is not the best. It's like a middle ground camera, your 60 Mark IIs, even though I hate the 60 Mark II personally. The 60 Mark II is a good camera for vlogging and autofocus and using a mass amount of lenses for a cheap price and having a full frame sensor on you. Yes, dynamic range ain't all that great, but the 60 Mark II is a good camera in this price range. The 70 Mark II is an amazing camera when it comes to focusing and doing sports and wildlife and doing almost everything that you need to do except vlogging, because the screen doesn't flip out. But it does pretty much everything else a 60 Mark II does except have a full frame sensor. I'm telling you, the 70 Mark II is the GOAT. Is the dark horse, is the camera that pretty much almost defeated the 1DX Mark II when it came out. So, and it has 20 plus megapixels, a little bit over 20 megapixels, and almost 10 frames a second. It's amazing for a camera at that price point. And the D500, I believe, on the Nikon side is also gives Nikon some love here. But you know, $3,000 to $7,000 if you can spend on that for a body, then you can pretty much get almost any camera that you want in any range in any of these three brands. Question number 11. Which would you rather have in a camera? Now, this question is a little loaded, I know, but when you start to understand cameras over a decade, over 2 decades, or however long you end up spending studying about cameras, learning about cameras, you understand that there's a difference in whether you're getting an old camera with new specs or a new camera with old specs. And you might be saying, Devin, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't a camera brand just give you the most specs for the amount of money that you're buying? A camera brand would never give you old specs for the amount of money that you're buying if you're buying something new, right? Wrong. For example, like I told you before, Canon has made a T2i, T3i, T4i, T5i, T6i, and there are almost all of them. Well, not the T6i, but pretty much T5i on down to the T2i. Almost all of them are exactly the same cameras, and these are the cameras that you're probably going to be buying because these are the ones that you see on the shelf. For example, if you look on, your Costco's and Targets, wherever you buy your cameras, Best Buy, whatever you go, whatever major retailer, Circuit City, you're probably going to see on the shelf your SL1s or your SL2s or your SL3s from Canon. Well, those are essentially the same camera. Now, the SL3 might be a little bit different, but the SL2 and the SL1, essentially the same camera. You might see the Canon 80D and you might see the Canon 90D. The only difference between these two cameras really is the 4K ability in the 90D. It's really not that big of a difference to constitute the amount of money that you're paying or to make up for the amount of money that you're paying. It's just like you understand that a lot of this stuff is recycled from the brand manufacturer, and you start to think about how much money you're spending and is it worth it based off of what you're getting. So you really end up upgrading for one major spec, like, oh, this camera has 4K, time to upgrade, because the camera manufacturer has been giving you the same specs in the last 6 iterations of that camera, and you're like, oh my goodness, oh, is mirrorless now? It's time to upgrade. No. It's usually one big spec that makes everybody upgrade with Canon. Canon is known to do this a lot, is to just either take away new technology that they've had in their previous cameras iteration, or they'll just not put in something that we know they have the ability to put in. Maybe it's because of a whole bunch of reasons, but we know Canon is the worst. Shout out to Camera Conspiracies for the cripple hammer, because Camera Conspiracies always talks about what Canon does to cripple their cameras. Same thing kind of with Nikon. Nikon is known to make some relatively similar cameras, especially on the lower end, just to kind of mass produce stuff, because they make the most money at the lower end. People who are less likely to spend $1,000 for the camera, they make the most money off of them, so they tend to put out recycled, I'm not going to say crap, because most of these cameras are great. They just don't really update them all that much for the next iteration. So you understand what I mean by, is it a new camera with new specs or a new camera with old specs? Or, see what I'm saying? So you have to understand exactly what you're getting. So Devin, what you getting at here? So for example, if you want an old camera with some modern specs, you're probably going to want to buy a camera like an old Canon 1DX Mark I, because this is an old camera, but it has some modern day specs on it because it was the flagship of its day. The same thing with the Canon 5D Mark III. Canon 5D Mark III wasn't a great camera for its day, but for its day, it had some of the higher end specs for the Canon line. Now, Nikon and Sony, or at least Nikon, was really doing them up with the 5D Mark III, but the 5D Mark III on the Canon end did not do a really good job as far as competing. But if you want a cheaper camera that's already been out for a while and it has some modern day specs for its time, then you might want to get the flagship that came out at that time. You see what I'm saying? That's why I have the 5D Mark II, because it has some class-leading specs for its time, but it's now 13 years old and it still competes. Why? Because the camera manufacturers, from camera to camera, like I said, don't really do that much of a difference, especially under the $1,000, $1,500 price point. I'm Devin with CFX Studios, guys. Thanks for watching. I know this video went on for quite a little while, but I really want to impress upon you how important it is for you to buy the best camera that you think you should need. And nobody really can tell you exactly which camera to buy. It is all about what you think is best for you based on maybe this information and any other information that you'll research. Stay tuned for the next video.